to call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
You are, yes.
First, I'm going to start by debunking this ridiculous claim that religion is always with the authoritarian regime. I think, in a lot of extent, to a lot of extent, even in the worst, even in the best case scenario, even if religion is to a certain extent supporting the authoritarian regime, I don't think religion in any form is as uniform as they would like it to be. So, for example, if you look at Islam, if you look at Christianity, in any country in the world, not every religious leader, not every religious institution that exists within this country will be supporting the authoritarian regime. Obviously, Alawite clerics will probably support Bashar al-Assad within Syria, but there are obviously Sunni clerics who will oppose Bashar al-Assad as well. But more importantly, if you look at the Arab Spring, for example, in a lot of protests that happened, it did include religious institutions, including in places like Libya, etc., Tunisia, etc., where there were religious leaders who came out and spoke against authoritarianism, because to the extent to which there is a significant protest movement within a particular country means that there is a significant amount of public opinion against that authoritarian regime for that protest to exist to begin with, and that comes with a lot of grievances that to a certain extent may even be economic or otherwise, which means that in those instances, religion, being an important part of society, does have an incentive to oppose the authoritarian leader if it is sort of the popular sentiment going forward. But the other thing that they say is that, oh, but they're going to enter into our movement and sabotage it. No, we are probably not that stupid as protesters. We probably won't let them do that in general. But just look at the analysis in general. Like in fighting that happens because of religion, etc., etc. We think rather, given the context we're operating in, where you talk about post-colonial regimes in Africa or Asia, given the level of religiosity that people have, religion is actually likely to be a very good unifying force as opposed to anything else in these instances. Because oftentimes when there are protests against authoritarian regimes, there are differences in opinion, because obviously not every individual is within the same wavelength when they're protesting against a particular regime. They will have different demands, a different conception of a state beyond that authoritarian regime. So it might be, for example, something that is a socialistic state, and people may disagree with that particular idea. But religion is the one thing in a lot of instances that is common between, say, 80% to 90% of the population who belong to the majority, whose voices matter the most, especially when taking down an authoritarian regime. The problem that they have here is that, okay, you may exclude minority religions and people who belong to minority groups. Here's the issue, right? Minority religions already get oppressed under authoritarian regime. So oftentimes the first priority that you have is taking down that authoritarian regime and then maybe worrying about things. But secondly, when you take down that authoritarian regime, even if there is a form of religiosity within the institutions of your state, which is likely to happen if the majority belongs to a particular religion anyways, even in the name of democracy. Look at India, for example, which is probably one of the best secularist institutions in terms of democracy all across the world, but it has a huge tinge of religion within all of its institutions because of the way in which majority sentiments work, meaning that democracy is the first step towards any form of secularism or any form of inclusive society that you're looking at in these places. So even if you exclude minority religions in the protest, the most important thing is taking down that authoritarian regime, and so on and so forth. And the other stuff, I don't even know how to respond to certain things like, oh, they'll see property damage, etc., is a sin. It's a protest. Obviously, there's sentiments that are going there, and like big blood, whatever. I really don't know how to respond to that. In general, in talking about like Asian and African context, what I'm going to talk about in extension to Amrit. But before, I think CEO had a POI to Amrit, which I'd like to take. If there is any POI from CEO. Now it's fine. Okay. So why is inclusion of religion in these places so important, particularly going forward with the protest itself? Because particularly oftentimes when you look at these protests gain a particular amount of momentum going forward. Even if you look at countries like Lebanon, which is particularly not authoritarian, but still is a relevant example with regards to like protests trying to gain momentum within these spaces. Oftentimes, the most important thing that is for them is to be able to use the amount of clout that exists at that particular moment to reach out to the most amount of people. Here's the problem, right? Oftentimes, as Amrit pointed out, there's a lot of capture going on by the authoritarians, especially within media levels, that restricts people from accessing information in particular. And access of information becomes the most important thing in these places. People oftentimes do not know the way in which the authoritarian regime is particularly oppressive towards them and why they should join the protest and why the protest is particularly beneficial for them. This is where religious leaders integration become important, even if in a lot of cases some religious leaders obviously won't accept the invitation of the protest to join them. It is still important to reach out to these religious leaders who control communities, especially within rural areas where often these protests go to die. Especially because a lot of protests in these places, if you look at the Arab Spring, for example, is city centric, but oftentimes these rural areas are still strongholds of these authoritarian regimes. The reason this becomes particularly important is even if under opposition, if you have some change through these protests, for example, you have an urban upheaval and you either overthrow the authoritarian regime or you get some concessions, at best, you still exclude a huge chunk of the population within these countries that are never included either within your protest demands or the way in which you move forward going in these countries. And the country remains divided throughout. If you do not get a unifying strength, you get a broken form of governance like the one you see right now in Myanmar, which still has a huge amount of military influence within government because you were never able to get rid of the structures of oppression that existed within authoritarian regimes. For you to be able to take down certain structures or at least get some concession out of it, you need to make sure that you include large swaths of this population. And structurally speaking, although Amrit already added to the reasons why structurally speaking these countries are likely to have that level of religiosity included within them, oftentimes these people feel excluded out of movements in a lot of cases because they don't include the thing that matters the most to their sentiments. Oftentimes these protests turn out to be a protest of just urban middle class people who are just demanding about their issues as opposed to rural conservatives who are incredibly important in taking down certain regimes, even though all of the people realize that the authoritarian regime is probably oppressing them in one way or the other, because authoritarianism comes with a huge amount of cost. A huge part of your economy has to be spent within like defense, etc., means that a lot of people are likely to be oppressed regardless. You just need to make sure that you include them within strands of protest that you did not include them before. That form of inclusivity is the most important within this debate if protests are to get anything, even if that's a concession or an overthrow of the government. Otherwise, you end up with a broken democracy like you find in Myanmar, incredibly proud of course.
of government.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, perfect. Starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I think at the point at which opening opposition, I've already said that religious tensions might exist in this society. I think even if this is true, if multiple religions support activist movements that are all in direct opposition to the state, I think the shared opposition to this authoritarian state provides direct incentives for religious collaboration. I think even if this spawns multiple disparate protest movements, they all eventually inevitably will have to have the shared goal of like opposition to the state. I think if anything, this is likely to alleviate religious tensions, at least in the short term. I think this generally just falls on our side. I'm going to do a few things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to do some reframing. I'm going to do a bit more of a realistic characterization of what this is likely to look like. Then I'm going to talk about why religious figures are best enabled to act on the ground, like as individual activists. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some impacts of this that don't require the same like ridiculously high burden that our opening took. Okay. I think this is probably going to be internally within existing domestic religious structures, but I think also and crucially, this is going to look like external support from outside actors of the same denomination. This could be NGOs, this could be like church missions, things like this. I think why religious figures are best enabled to act on the ground, I think what this probably will look like is likely being present some kind of state religion or prominent religion. And what is key here is that often these states already accept significant aid from religious organizations for the reason of like religious NGOs being seen as comparatively harmless in the eyes of the state, fully westernized institutions that are like godless. Also, I think religious organizations are often afforded more freedoms as these states rely on like legitimization through appeals to a higher authority often. I think lastly then, there's a greater potential for external retaliation from other states if religious figures are harmed in comparison to representatives of multi-denominational organizations. The killing of a priest being escalatory to a greater extent to literally every surrounding nation which subscribes to that religious denomination. I think why these figures are best suited for activism then. Firstly, on secrecy. I think religious figures and ceremonies are granted a substantial level of privacy. They're often seen as sacred and henceforth they are granted an elevated level of sanctity. I think that they're also generally just seen as more harmless. I'd like to note that like almost no intelligence agency in the world would allow like one of their members to disguise themselves as a religious figure. I think they are relatively like pre-vetted for this. I think they also have a unique ability to have a valid excuse for private communication with citizens. This could be in ceremonies that necessitate it, like ritualized confession, or just through the ability for them to hold sermons within communities and just being able to like communicate ideas, values, logistics like this with an entire community on a regular basis. I think they have enhanced comparative ability to mobilize and organize. This could be planning protests or other subversive activities, or better yet, this could be distribution of aid so it can't be co-opted by a corrupt government to fund more like torture camps or whatever. I think we also get more effective messaging. Firstly, noting that religions are generally hierarchical, and secondly, that religious figures occupy unique positions of authority within communities. I think why this is true, because they're seen as a representative of God on earth, but also they're often already local leaders and already act as a de facto local government, noting that authoritarian states generally have poorly established government institutions as they expend so much capital on suppression of like protests and defense. I think this means figures are likely to have massive influence on a local level, but also their ideas carry weight. I think also you're able to set up a dichotomy between your religion and your spiritual identity with your national identity that's been like forced on you by your authoritarian government, why it's so difficult to break out of this kind of brainwashing. I think we're able to have more on the ground support for activist movements. Lastly, on safety, I think because of all of this analysis about community buy-in, religious figures occupy uniquely like protected classes in society. It's harder for authoritarian governments to crack down on their activities without massive public outcry and the potential for escalation, leading like the regime to be more vulnerable to outside interference because their resources are more spread thin on trying to like suppress outrage from all these religious groups, right? I think this means religious figures are uniquely able to disincentivize state violence when they're engaging in activism, and the same level of activism that equivalent like non-denominational organizations might be trying to do. I think what this activism looks like and why it's likely to be good, but before I move on, I'll take opening.
We've given no incentives analysis why religious leaders would want to do any of these things. But even if they did, you get far better international media support and attention when you aren't affiliated with the oppressive religious institution that the movement was trying to stop.
I think firstly, religious organizations typically want the best outcomes for members of their own denomination. They're like they are uniquely incentivized to like save souls, but also like generally ideas of piety and mercy and like wanting to generally help people. I think that is probably why they're like incentivized to engage in this in the first place. I think this is just also not really engaging with the fact this is a believes motion. This activism looks like why it's likely to be good. Firstly, on distribution of resources. I think this could just be like external aid or just from local church donations, something like this. Religious figures are able to do this without interference or co-option of resources by like corrupt government agencies, like to the same degree that other institutions are likely to experience it. I think this is a material improvement in alleviation of suffering and increased access to the like stakeholders that suffer the most in this debate. I think secondarily, on distribution of activist material, I think you get quicker, less scrutinized and more regular access to communication channels on a community level. This looks like protest organization. This looks like subversive actions. This could be like staging a protest during a religious event. I think you get more public buy-in to these activist movements, and at the very least you force the government to address concerns in a way that doesn't escalate to violence because they don't want to see like this religious retaliation or retaliation from external states. I think you get more benign policy adoption and more concessions by the state. They're more incentivized to treat their citizens like to a basic like degree of like safety because they like will face this retaliation. I think lastly then we also get more buy-in of outside actors. I think other actors necessarily have a stake when the religious denomination is placed in opposition with the government. I think this looks like, if this is like Islam, this looks like support of other Islamic states for taking down your authoritarian regime because the religion is opposed to that regime. If it's Christian, it looks like getting global Christian support. I think you force foreigners to care about your plight at the point at which their religious beliefs are being called into question if they are negligent or they neglect to oppose your authoritarian regime. I think this looks like putting more political pressure on foreign governments to send their support, to send their aid directly through these religious organizations that are uniquely equipped to help people. I think this also looks like more material support from religious people around the globe. I think all of these things are like obvious goods. I think a lot of what we get out of opposition is mitigatory at best. I think a lot of what we get out of our opening at best is lacking mechanization and is lacking a realistic overview of what this actually looks like on the ground and how this takes place. And for all of these reasons, I'm so proud to propose.
I thank the member of government and I'm happy to call upon the member. on the opposition. Sorry, I thank the member of opposition. I'm happy to call upon the government whip.
Well, could I check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
All right, Bowery, let me just get my timer sorted. Sort my notes out. I'm a messy boy. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. OG have no mechanisms. O have no comparative. CO are probably quite derivative. I think Cerys has probably put us in quite good stead. I want to provide you 3 weighing mechanisms as to why Cerys's extension takes over opening before I deal with the opposition bench. 1. I think Cerys provides you the step-by-step analysis as to how this is actually going to look beyond religious leaders now, protest movements now co-opt these religious leaders, therefore we get buy-in. What does this co-option of religious institutions look like? I think it looks like specifically on the ground cooperations between NGOs engaging with fucking, how do you say, priests and whatever of their specific denomination. Note that there are a lot of these that exist in the West. The West is not a non-religious monolith like opening opposition seem to believe. You are able to accrue support from this, and subsequently you are able to get things like distributions of activist material. You are able to engage in some degree of secrecy, and even if we are not getting the massive social upheaval and regime change that top half seem to believe is the metric of this debate, we are able to engage in things like the provision of community support centres, and we are able to engage in things like targeted aid. The only manner in which closing opposition responds to Cerys's extension is to say that the secrecy isn't that much of a tipping point because these regimes are bad for some reason. I want to note that this debating is comparative. That is to say, maybe we aren't totally secret, but we are more secret and harder to detect than what the comparative is. Given this, then, we think they are still preferable actors and are probably unlikely going to be attacked, insofar as these religious leaders are contingent on their piety for legitimacy, and subsequently, at the point that they are perceived to have done something that is an affront to that piety, they are likely going to lose that legitimacy. Second weighing mechanism as to how we beat opening government. I think, where was it? Yeah. I think opening government are kind of reliant on the asserted counterfactual that this necessarily has to be a comparative between the exclusion of religion and the incorporation of religion. I think opposition bench reasonably challenge them on this, and Cerys is non-contingent on this counterfactual, insofar as Cerys uniquely proves to you that it is not the avoidance of this counterfactual that is the metric of the debate, but rather it is specifically the unique intrinsic benefits brought from this. And this is the final weighing mechanism as to why I think we're taking it on the government bench. Cerys is the unique speaker in this debate to analyze why it has to be specifically the incorporation of religious figures and institutions rather than a sort of cooperation that occurs in a more soft way like both opposition takers stand over. Cerys uniquely explains that it is the pre-existing supply lines, reliance on aid from religious institutions, and the trust that individuals have with them that means necessarily it has to come through a degree of cooperation, insofar as it is the institutions that uniquely provide you this mechanism to engage in mobilization, provide services, and avoid detection. This means that we are able to get all of this distribution of aid to those who are involved in the protest. This means that we are able to centralize the activist movements, and this means crucially that we do not take the trade-off the opening government take with regards to the consequences that occur at the point that you engage in case construction. Given this, then, we think we're winning. Let's deal with the opening opposition POIs to this, because opening opposition push back by saying, firstly, that the leaders aren't going to be incentivized, and secondly, on international media support. I just want to deal with this weird thing about what religious leaders aren't going to be incentivized. Nobody in this speaker debate could name me a fucking religion that supports the oppression of people, right? I think at the point that religious leaders want what is best for their flock, and there are specific NGOs that are already engaging in these protest movements, given these are pre-existing, I think necessarily religious leaders are going to detect that this is a path of least resistance to engage in their holy duty. At the point that you specifically shift the optics to this being a holy duty rather than something that is simply opposed to the regime, this is necessarily when you are able to co-opt the incentives of religious leaders. On international media support, 3 responses. 1, I'm unsure who cares in the status quo. Two, I think the reason why people don't support protest movements in the developing world right now is because they are perceived as neo-colonial. At the point where you specifically align yourself with the religious and cultural values of these places and co-opt the pre-existing movements that exist, you are less likely to be perceived as an imposition, and you are more likely to be supported. Third thing, even if that isn't true, I think people have the nuance to necessarily recognize that this is a means to an end. This deals with all of the stuff regarding buy-in that we get from the opposition bench. I think people are able to engage in a rational calculus, and they are able to weigh off that the goals that are provided from this probably are worth sacrificing any degree of like opposition that you have to the religion, even if that does exist. Given that these people have already risked their lives to participate in the protest, and they will probably take whatever they can get in order to make it more successful, I think it's highly likely that this isn't going to be a tipping point for any degree of support that exists. I think therefore we are able to get the majority of the buy-in insofar as one, we co-opt what is pre-existing, two, we align with religious leaders and their pre-existing supply lines, and three, we specifically attack those who are in the cogs of position of power in terms of piety. Two things remaining: dealing with CO, dealing with what's left from OO. Cool. CO's broad contention in this debate is that the framing is the memory of religious conflict that is possessed, and subsequently the multitude of religions in these states means that we are unable to accrue change. A couple of responses to this. One, I think this is probably important to get a common goal in order to specifically act as a unifying force. Why is this true? One, because I think you are specifically able to recognize that something is bigger than yourself at the point that you have the optic signaling of all of these religions cooperating towards the same thing. I think this is when you are likely going to get better relations. But secondarily, and I think this is a really important, unique analysis from Cerys, at the point now protest, what's specifically able to see is a traceable, quantifiable interaction between one religion and people to other religions, whereby you are able to visibly see that this person of a different religion is helping you in this protest. They are giving you supplies, they are giving you this targeted aid, they are providing safety for you in order to defeat your common enemy. I think we are more likely to get unification at the point that people are able to visibly trace that this is the manner in which other religions are helping them. Third thing to say is, I think you probably maybe you do get dealing with the opposition bench. Maybe you do get some degree of dilution from the less moderate wings of it. But I think at the point that you presumably also have more radical wings, they now have plausible deniability to act in secrecy at the point that they are under the banner of what is perceived as the monolithic religion. They are more able to do things, but at the same time, those who are the more moderate ones are diluting, are probably fairly non-comparative insofar as they are already those who are viewed. Given this, then, we get a marginal gain. That takes out opening opposition's contingencies regarding both dilution, regarding buy-in. Last thing to say regarding opening opposition, if I'm able to find my notes, is I think at the point that the case construction thing is contingent on some degree of social upheaval actually occurring. I think one, it is non-comparative insofar I'm unclear as to how this is worse than the status quo. And two, I think the specific burden reached to actually get this is never filled to prevent the most realistic impact. CG.
I thank the government whip. I'm happy to call upon the opposition whip.
Give me 1 second. Oh, no. Yes. Okay. Excellent. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. Three, two, one. This debate isn't necessarily about whether adding a movement gets you a little bit more people or a little bit less people. The core of the debate is whether the added marginal revenue of religion's financial investment, and thereby sometimes also their popular support, is outweighed by the restrictions that such a movement or the alignment of parts of that movement will put on you, and what those restrictions are. Cat's exclusive extension is: what are those restrictions, why are they likely, how do they function, and why are they weighing out the added part of people that you get. And she gives you a couple of answers, namely that it forces people to make a choice, and that the choice is likely to more often fall to side government than to side protest, which is why most of the power still will addedly now explicitly go to that government, and that is bad. Secondly, why it excludes you from making other alignments, and thereby you probably get less people, the less powerful people, and you stop yourself from getting any other forms of support, and we think that's bad. Before I go on into weighing that extension over the rest of the debate, a couple of points of rebuttal. 6, I'm very sorry. First, to OG, I'm going to say this again, and I really want that the last time to be said. We are not against religion, and we don't have to be against religion. You can perfectly say that it's fine for you to do your 5 times of prayers a day. It is that your agenda setting doesn't exclusively line itself up with a minority faction of a particular religion. Second, it is unfair to just say that if you cater towards a religion, the entirety of that religion will go in. First, because religions are diverse and they have similar smaller factions. But second, catering towards a religion doesn't mean that your catering is successful. It means that it may be, to some people, successful. That means that maybe some parts or some preachers or some people from that religion will follow you and thereby will support you. That means that the others, by that mechanism, will definitely be against you. I think that's the majority. Second, why I think that it's unfair for you then can just pick and choose the religion that is best or the religion that is biggest. 2, because if the religion is very big and very successful and very followed, the government, who's been in power for a long time, probably had already the calculation that that religion needed support and a lot of money, and that probably also means they already rest on a lot of money. That means, OG, that the moment you cater towards them, the majority of that religion will still go to government because the government already supported them, and they know they lose that support when they don't. That means you probably get marginal parts of the religion into you, or the religions that are already smaller. 3, you get momentum. 1, I already countered this by saying you don't necessarily get the added revenue that much to get the momentum. But second, hunger also creates momentum amongst people to collectivize. I'm unsure why the religion particularly there is so necessary, specifically given that it's already quite small. Cool. Up into CG. Religious figures are harmed. Oh no, look, the entirety of, I think, the year 1000 to the year 2000 shows that government has no problem with shooting religious figures the moment that religious figures go against either the majority religion, which is likely to support them, or when religious figures just don't do what they say because they like their power more than they like religion. And that is unfortunate, but it's really true. Second, but now you get more, now you no longer get foreign support, or something changes on foreign support. Here comes a thing. Foreign states always have a incentive to support you, the protest movement, because the decline of the power of that state means an increase of power of other states. Maybe some other states will ally with the dictator state. Maybe they do, but by that same metric, other states will also do it. And if a other state will support you, so will another religion. That same dynamic goes there. I think that the added financial benefits you give is really, really marginal, because states also tend to be really rich. Then, lastly, why or what happens to the distribution of resources and why is that so important? I already said a lot of other states also have an incentive to fuel you, and they've also had an incentive to fund you. I'm unsure why the added marginal revenue that then you get by aligning yourself to religion, given the fact that the way that alignment goes is likely to be unsuccessful and marginal, is really such an impact. What does Kat then say? 1, because you align yourself with a religion which is unlikely to compromise, which cannot give up its agenda without undermining its own legitimacy, forces other people to make that explicit choice. There's 2 ways in which he explains that is particularly bad. The first one is that forced choice means that you actively drive other people to camp government. The majority of people who don't necessarily want to comply with government, who are fine individually giving or compensating on their religion, but collectively can't do anything else than following it, stop badgering OG, is probably now going towards the government, which otherwise would either have been neutral or not have cared at all. It means that especially when you are a smaller protest movement and you actually need that leverage step by step, you now immediately force the camps into where you have no reason to success for that and you're likely to fail. The second one is that both protest movements and religions are diverse. That means that when you are a protest movement and you align yourself with one minority religion, that means that you are now no longer capable of either also cooperating with the other protest movement who has aligned themselves with another form of religion. Because religions don't compromise and they don't allow you to cooperate with the other one that says or preaches something else than you. That means you cut your own leverage there. Whereas on the counterfactual, if you probably would have wanted to do something and you needed cooperation with another movement that may not have been perfectly fine with you, then probably that other movement still has the same end goal of overthrowing the government and is willing to compromise. But you limit that kind of leverage where you get this tiny fraction of the leverage that you get from social movements. Before I continue, sure, opening. Please be clear.
if you say that protest movements can endorse things like pray 5 times or the Christian love your neighbors, then you also get infracture. You also drive the people out in your world. It is not a matter of degree. If you say any position, you get the harms
No,
in the op bench.
But I made this comparative, right? Yes, if you align yourself with another movement, you drive some people out. But I think people who align themselves with a protest movement have the same goal as you from your protest movement. The end goal is to overthrow that government. You're more likely to compromise on smaller steps. The end goal of any religion is not to overthrow the government. It's to get in power and get followers. They are unlikely to compromise. That means you as a protest movement will always be second place. Jason, give up. I'm sorry. No. That means that you'll always be second place. That means you'll never get that leverage. Given Cat's unique mechanisms on why you're unlikely to get the full movement, you're unlikely to get the full religion, you're unlikely to get the most dominant religion, you get a tiny fraction of that, but you limit yourself from any other form of cooperation or state funding or anything else to get that leverage, you're unlikely to make those compromises you are unlikely to get the compromises from governments or gain the form of leverage that you otherwise have gotten if you didn't. We're still able to cater to religious people. We're still able to say to people, there still will be people who are willing to compromise on some parts. We're still able to be a movement, but we limit ourselves so much that we'll never get anywhere. That is why it's exclusive on our side to limit it. It's not exclusive on theirs. That's why I beg you to vote opposition.
I thank the opposition whip and all speakers in the debate. I now invite you to leave the room and we will call you back for the results.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.